I was a Chief Warrant Officer in the Army, and I was a advisor to the Commanding General of INSCOM, the Intelligence and Security Command. I was also advisor to some other generals in the Pentagon. And my purpose for being in the headquarters was actually to be in charge of my military occupational specialty, you know, what I did in the Army. But I was in charge of most of the mission and whatnot that we were doing. When we found out that the Russians and some of the other countries were using psychics, I was asked to review the materials that they obtained from them and to decide whether or not it could be considered a threat. And because I thought that it was possibly a threat if it was true, they sent me to Stanford Research Institute International, and I was tested there. And as a result, I was assigned to the project. I did very well on the remote viewings. They sent me to Stanford Research Institute to be tested as a psychic. If I could be trained to do remote viewing, then that would be a way of finding out if it was real. What we could do then is we could take people in the Army who were trained, and we could target our own stuff, you know, target the Pentagon, the White House, places like that, and then turn all of that material over to an independent agency who could evaluate it. And if they thought it was providing information of true value, then we would know that it was a threat and we needed to do something about it. I was sent to Stanford Research Institute, and I was tested by doing 6 remote viewings. I never heard of remote viewing before. And of my 6 remote viewings, 5 of them turned out to be exceptionally good, and 1 was close to that. I actually knew that I was psychic to some degree from when I was a small child, because I would know things ahead of time. I also spent 27 months in the Far East during wartime, and that sense of when something was going to happen or not happen was very useful in keeping me alive. So, but I didn't tell anybody. I didn't want anybody to know that I had that ability. So I kept it hidden, and this project brought it out. The entire project was only supposed to be 3 years, and the intent of the project was to determine if it was dangerous to America, and if we could train people to do this, and whether or not we could eventually develop some kind of a defense against it. So I think in the beginning it was this sort of grand idea of determining if it was real, and if it was real, producing some kind of a defense against it. And it failed in that because it worked so well, we just became operational. They didn't do any of the testing, they just went right into operations. Remote viewing is very simple. Remote viewing is being psychic, but operationally under very stringent controls, scientific controls. And those scientific controls require the remote viewer to have absolutely no access to any information about what they're working on. Nobody in the room with the remote viewer can have access to any of that information. The idea is you want to force the remote viewer to produce the information using psychic methods, not by guessing because they had a hint or somebody said, this thing we're looking at will fit in a box this big. You know, that it makes people it restricts them on what they're capable of saying. So if you keep someone completely blind and everybody talking to them completely blind, then it's almost difficult to tell who's more psychic, the person asking the question or the person giving the answer. When you do a remote viewing, you have the remote viewer and usually a monitor with the remote viewer, and they're both totally blind. So what we found is when the remote viewer is targeted, the methodology that they use so that the remote viewer has no information is they give them a number, a random number, which represents the target. Or they may give them a double-wrapped opaque envelope with a question inside that they want answered, but nobody knows what's in the envelope. So the remote viewer has to psychically open their mind to the target and produce whatever comes into their mind. As they're doing this, the monitor may ask them questions to clarify some of the things they may say. And what we found was sometimes the monitor would ask exactly the right question at exactly the right time to get the answer that everybody was looking for. So that's the remote viewing part. When the material's produced by the remote viewer, that then goes to someone who transcribes it, puts it into a package, and then it goes to the analyst or the person who's going to use it. So there was never any contact. Like if an analyst came from the CIA and wanted to know something, they would put that question in the envelope. The remote viewer and the monitor would produce the information, and that would be sent in a transcribed form back to that agent at the CIA. So they never communicated. They never had any contact at all. We had no validation during the remote viewing. Any validation that we had that we were right or wrong, that came much later after they closed that particular target down. Because you may be asked to remote view it 3 or 4 times, or even more. And in some cases, we had 3 or 4 remote viewers targeting the same target. So if 3 people said the same thing, it probably could be more accurate than not. Just for 1 or 2 agencies, I probably did 2,000 or 3,000 remote viewings. So, and I did lots of remote viewings for the Army and the science and the labs. And when everything stopped, I was doing remote viewing for private individuals, for companies, you know, all kinds of things like that. So, you know, thousands of remote viewings. I did remote viewing for probably 45 years. The first thing I always tried to do was to stop thinking about everything that I was thinking about. So everything that I came into the room with, I would try to empty my mind from those things, stop addressing them. That's very difficult, especially when I was working for different agencies, because I might do 5 remote viewings in one day, and each one was just as important as the last one. I learned to concentrate and empty my mind and be in a place of no thinking, just a meditative sort of state. It's very difficult to achieve, but over time you learn to do that. And then once you're in that state of mind, you then listen to the targeting information, which might be a series of numbers, or it could be an envelope or something. You open to whatever that target is, and the first thing that comes in your mind is usually what we call a gestalt. It's like a general drawing of whatever the target might be. So I would put the gestalt down, I would draw the gestalt, and then I would ask myself, why? Why did I draw that? What are the reasons behind that? And I would get bits and pieces of information associated to that. And some of those bits of information, I would have to ask myself what my subconscious was trying to say to me. When you're doing collection, that's totally different because the reason for doing the remote viewing becomes more imperative. For instance, it may be a kidnap victim. You may be working against a terrorist organization, or you may be trying to find out some information of what are the Soviets doing inside this building. So doing the operational missions were much more intense. They required an answer. They had a building in the Soviet Union that had been the target of the National Security Council, the NSC, for almost a year and a half. And they didn't know what was happening in that building. And so they asked that I be targeted on that building. And my target was a two-digit number. That's all it was. But it was the label that they gave that building. Not a word, just two digits. And so when I targeted the building, the first impression I had was two letters, C and a backwards C, being put together like this. And I asked why. How is that happening? And the next images I got were very bright lights that almost hurt the eyes if you were to look at them. And I interpreted that to be welding of some kind, using a special kind of laser. And then I noticed that this was an old technology being modernized. So eventually I worked my way to the idea that this was probably a big submarine. And so I put the data together that I was getting psychically and started writing out what the images were and what they meant to me. And my final conclusion was this was a new kind of submarine that was very, very big. And it had new technology because instead of missiles going in straight up and down, it had missiles going in at a slant, which is different in the technology. So I started listing the differences in the technology. And by the time I got through, it was a modern submarine. It was, I said it was about 30 feet shy of the length of a Soviet aircraft carrier. So it was very big. And it was maybe 80 feet wide, which is very large. And when that was sent in to the National Security Council, it was sent back, and they said that that was total fantasy because there's no such thing. And I sent it back, and it made me angry. So I sent it back, and I said, no, this isn't fantasy. This will be launched in 112 days. Well, the admiral that was carrying it back to the National Security Council wanted to get some pictures of this. So he said, in his mind, he said, well, if Joe says it will be launched in 112 days, then I will ensure pictures are taken of the building in 114 days. And at 114 days, this submarine had been launched and was sitting in the harbor with its doors open. So we got some beautiful pictures of a brand new submarine called the Typhoon class submarine. And it was the TK-089. It was the first one of 9 of these that the Soviet Union built. It's the only one we ever saw. So we got that. We got the pictures of it. We got all the details of it because of remote viewing. They had a picture of the building. They put the picture in an envelope. They put that envelope in another envelope, so you can't see, okay? They put a number on the envelope, and they said your target is number 77 in that envelope, name 77. That's all I ever got. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's a smell or a taste or pain, or it could be anything, colors. Sometimes the senses are mixed up. It's called synesthesia. It's when someone alters the way their senses work. For instance, you might hear colors as a sound, or you might see music as a drawing. The senses are mixed up. When the senses are mixed up and getting that information as a remote viewer, more times than not it's correct, because the subconscious is trying to say something that it has no language for. So it will use whatever it can to deliver the message. General Dozier was kidnapped in Italy. That was one of my first remote viewings. And I kept saying, now, when he was kidnapped, they had a 12-hour head start. They kidnapped him in the evening, and nobody knew he was kidnapped until the next morning. So he could be anywhere in Europe in 12 hours. He could be in the Eastern Bloc countries, or he could be in the Western side. And when they asked me where he was, I kept saying he's in Padua. Now, Padua is the archaic name, the old ancient name, for the very city he was taken in. So they didn't take him anywhere. And because I was using the archaic name, I said he's probably in the old part of the city. So I had drawn a fountain and a building and a cul-de-sac, an end road. And one of our other remote viewers described how he was being held and on what floor of this apartment building and everything. And then they captured the brother of one of the terrorists. Now, he didn't know where they were, but he knew where they had been. And so they were able to match where they had been to our descriptions. And they raided that building, and that's how they found him. And they probably prevented him from being killed. We brought General Dozier to our office, and we asked him to read everything that had been said about him during our attempt to find him. And he read the material 2 or 3 times. And his conclusion was, he said that the material is so accurate that you need to start a school where you teach important people how to think to aid in their own rescue with use of remote viewers. I thought that was pretty astounding. We developed probably between 1.6 and 1.8 million words of science on remote viewing. It's the most studied thing probably in the world. And in all that information, we still have no idea, not one idea of how the information gets from that building to my head. Nobody knows. We don't know when it happens if it's going to be accurate or inaccurate. We just don't know. I think they shut the program down because, for two reasons. One was it had been operational for over 20 years, and it was doing a very good job for probably 12 to 15 different agencies. We were supporting everybody with it, and it worked. And that's a problem because we were unable to develop a defense against it. And if you can't develop a defense, then the best way to deal with it is to ridicule it, release bad information, and then shut it down. And then people will believe that it didn't work.